Alright guys, let's go over some more of the review questions and then we'll finish up with everything tomorrow. Alright, so if you will get out your review sheets that says Vietnam Era 2, we're working on the second part of this, and we're going to work on 1 through 5 today, and then we'll do 6 through 10 tomorrow. And as long as you're following along, you should be able to finish with everything tomorrow. Alright, this number 1 says, this was a famous student group that opposed the war and helped to organize protests around the world. And that is talking about the SDS. SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Number 2 says, this was the turning point of Vietnam when public opinion decided that the war was a lost cause. And, Tet Offensive, T-E-T, Tet Offensive. And if you're following along in your notes, these answers go box by box in your notes. It's the second page of notes on Vietnam. Okay, next. Number 3, where was the 1968 Democratic Presidential Convention, where many protesters were violently met by police? And that was held in Chicago. Chicago, Illinois. Chicago. All right. Next. Number 4 says, who won the 1968 election? And that's Richard Nixon. So Nixon's going to come in and win the 68 election. We really think that number 1, it's the Democrats' fault that we're in this mess. So, maybe the Republicans can fix everything. And the second thought is we remember and associate the 1950s and Eisenhower years and good times with Nixon, so we're thinking Nixon's going to bring all that back. All right, next question is number 5, and it says, what is the name of his policy to start pulling ground troops out of Vietnam while using more Vietnamese fighters as well? And that is talking about Vietnamization. So Vietnamization is the idea that we are going to start... Sorry, I'm trying to multitask. That we're going to start training Vietnamese soldiers to take care of themselves so we can take U.S. soldiers back home. So that's Vietnamization. All right, now I want you to grab your other review sheet. This one's got like the stars up and down it. We're on the back side. It says NAM, nickname for Vietnam War, NAM, and we're working on 22 through 30 for today. All right, let's get going. All right, so it says, 22 says, colonized by the French, that's the first blank, French, Vietnam found its most successful rebel and communist and later North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh and his revolutionaries and later regular army known as the Viet Hinh. Viet Hinh, M-I-N-H, Vietnam, and then put I-N-H at the end, Viet Hinh. Alright, 23. The French were eventually defeated and evicted from French Indochina in 1954 after a communist win at, skip that one. We don't talk about that battle. Skip it. Skip 23. On to 24. Alright, 24 says Vietnam was then divided by the 17th parallel. 17th parallel. Its two distinct nations were North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The Communist North had its capital under Ho Chi Minh at Hanoi, H-A-N-O-I, Hanoi. The Nationalist South had its government under President Diem at the southern capital of Saigon, S-I-A-G-O-N, Saigon. 25 says during this time, an opposition group made up of communists developed in the South known as the Viet Cong, the most common enemy encountered by the GIs, American GIs. 26 says Ho Chi Minh started to supply the Southern Communists with weapons and supplies, moving them along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. that through Vietnam's neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia and into South Vietnam through tunnels. 27 says, in August of 1964, President Johnson announced that the North Vietnamese had attacked 2 U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Gulf of Tonkin. 28 says, as a result, Johnson launched bombing raids on the North Vietnamese. Congress adopted the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I know that's a lot. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This was not a declaration of war, but it did increase the military presence. 29 says the Viet Cong were willing to fight to the end and were hoping to win a war of attrition to wear them down with numbers of people killed. And 30, most men were drafted into the military by the Selective Service, and many American men sought deferment to get into the Army later, often because of going to college, or found other ways to avoid the draft. All right, stop there. Grab your packets. The other day, I kind of got behind. We're going to do 26-2, and then I'll get you caught back up with doing 26-3 tomorrow. And then you'll only have that first page front and back in your packets. All right, so follow along with me. Number 1, here we go. It says, in the spring of 65, a Gallup poll showed that 66% of Americans approved of the policy in Vietnam. Number 2 says Vietnam was the first televised, that's your blank, televised war with footage of combat. All right, next, number 3. Although he had helped create the policy of containment, American diplomat George Kennan argued that Vietnam was not strategically important. Number 4, a group of faculty members and students at the University of Michigan joined together for a teach-in to discuss opposition to the war. Number 5 says minorities, particularly African Americans, made up disproportionately large numbers of soldiers in Vietnam. Number 6 says in April of 67, MLK Jr. broke his silence and publicly condemned the conflict in Vietnam. Number 7, by 1968, the nation was divided into 2 camps. The Doves, who wanted to withdraw, and the Hawks, which wanted to fight. Number 8 says protest against the war and the draft led to ratification of the 26th Amendment, which gave citizens 18 years old and older the right to vote. Number 9 says the Tet Offensive was a massive surprise attack by the Viet Cong on American air bases in South Vietnam. Number 10, with this action, the American people were shocked that an enemy supposedly on the verge of defeat could launch such a large-scale attack. Number 11 says, even Walter Cronkite, then the nation's most respected television newscaster, announced that it seemed certain Vietnam could end in a stalemate. Number 12, violence seemed to plague the country at every turn in 1968, including the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. 13 says the violence associated with the Democratic Party convention benefited the 1968 Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon. And 14 says independent presidential candidate George Wallace won 43 electoral college votes and more than 16 of the popular vote in 1968. All right, that's it for today.